With heavy hearts and pure determination, the party rode toward the city of Sprockton as quickly as they could, for as long as they could. Each member of the group tried their best to cope with the situation, whether it was whispered words to Gar, attempts to preserve his body, or single-minded travel. After several hours of travel, May could tell that Fenge was tired and the other horse could not travel any further, so she reluctantly suggested that the group stop for the evening to allow the horses some time to rest. While setting up camp, storm clouds slowly rolled in, causing rain to fall over the course of the evening. May needed to briefly return to the Midway Manor to retrieve something, and while looking for the key to the manor among Gar's possessions, she noticed a letter, simply titled, "To My Friends." May retrieved the note, intending to show the group after she returned from the manor. Laren noticed Mavis struggling while setting up a tent, and she offered her assistance, both of them sharing in a silent moment of sorrow and mutual understanding. May returned from the manor and showed the group the letter she found, which Mavis promptly took. Upon opening the letter, before Mavis could begin reading, everyone noticed that they began to hear the letter speak the words on its pages, in Gar's voice. The letter was clearly written by Gar as a will in the event of his death. He addressed each of the members of the group and told them how much he cared for them. He reminded them of their strengths and left some of his personal belongings with each of them. He also gave instructions on how he wanted to be buried, in a canoe set off to the sea that would be set ablaze, and to let his mother know of his passing. The group stood in silence as they absorbed the information, and Mavis dropped the note to the ground. Zeos retrieved the note while Mavis went to Gar's body to simply tell him that he would stop at nothing to bring him back. May spent some time reading a book on the art of fishing while also writing in her journal, and most of the group was able to get some rest. The next morning, the group wasted no time preparing the carriage for departure. As they were nearly ready to leave, Zeos noticed a dwarf walking along the main road with a shield on his back and a bindle propped on his shoulder, traveling the same direction as the group. When suddenly, everyone noticed that they no longer heard the sound of rain falling on the carriage. As they turned around, they saw rain falling on the ground as they would expect it to, but they also noticed raindrops beginning to curve in the air as they approached Gar's body. Almost like an invisible umbrella was covering Gar, forcing the rain to the side. It was as though whispers could be heard on the wind, even in the midst of the storm, as the raindrops began to form a dome around Gar. The droplets turned into sheets of water, and the sheets turned into waves that created an orb of water with Gar at its center. The orb began to float a few feet above the ground, with droplets continuing to gather towards the center of the orb. The group looked towards the sky as they heard the sounds of distant thunder, almost like a power was brewing that was preparing to do something. They could see clouds begin to form the shape of a fishing boat directly overhead, as one final crash of lightning and thunder echoed in the air. The boat dissipated, and the orb of water fell to the ground as the water crashed and flowed towards the surrounding grass, revealing Gar sitting with his arms resting on his knees and the water cascading off of his scales as he opened his eyes towards his friends. Gar's appearance had slightly changed. His silver nature became even more silvered, like his scales were oversaturated, and the blues on his scales turned to a deeper sapphire color. But other than that, he was the same old Gar. Zeos punched Gar square in the shoulder, causing Gar to say, "That's no way to treat a friend that's just come back from the dead," as Zeos simply replied, "But you always come back," and the group embraced their friend. Laren had no words other than overwhelming gratitude that Gar had returned. Mavis stood in wonder that his friend really returned from death, and May said that she would not let Gar fall again, as doing so would violate her oath. Gar thanked the party for their words, saying that he'd heard them in the afterlife, and that he met Melora, but would get into the details later. The rest of the group told Gar what had happened so far, and that they were not far off from Sprockton. Mavis gave Gar the chilling mug that he said he would make, which promptly exploded in a small puff of smoke, which was Mavis's method of payback for the potatoes, and continuing a war of pranks on each other. Mavis took the mug to fix it for later, and the group departed back on the road to Sprockton together. Gar used sending to send a message to Athenor, a message full of insults and berating words, to which Athenor simply replied with a sigh of annoyance. Gar began to share what he'd seen in the afterlife, and asked May if she'd heard of the name Kelemvor, which May said was the name of a deity that is a sort of neutral gatekeeper for those that have passed. Gar shared everything he'd seen, what Melora had told him about the night of the storm, the fact that his old crew was there, that they were happy, and that Nephair was still alive. Laren asked Gar who Nephair really was to him, and Gar said that she was one of his closest childhood friends, and someone he had a bit of a crush on. He said that they grew up going on adventures and solving mysteries together that his Uncle Jarlin had set up for them. Mavis had the sudden realization that Gar could use sending to contact Nephier now that he knew she was alive. Nervously, Gar agreed to contact her after all these years to see how she was doing. But after casting the spell, Gar didn't feel the spell connect to its target. Zeos mentioned that it could be due to protective magic preventing a connection and doesn't necessarily mean that she's dead or on another plane. Gar noticed that Zeos' sleeves were covered in blood, and Mavis mentioned that it was from the revenge taken on the archer that killed Gar. Gar asked if Zeos was okay, but Zeos seemed to dodge the question, insisting he was alright, so Gar let it go for the time being. Gar joined May at the front of the carriage and asked how she was doing, and May told Gar about what happened after Gar died, when she felt her mind reach out to all of the bandits with an anger and rage, and that the thing scared them. With everything still being a mystery, they agreed to add it to the list of things to figure out later. After a couple of hours, Gar and May noticed 8 distinct clouds that began approaching the group. Zeos recognized this as the Windwalk spell, just as one of the clouds materialized into a human that bore extravagant robes, an assortment of rings, long hair, and an over-the-top smile. The human introduced himself as Hubert Hen, leader of the Wind Riders, a traveling merchants guild that offered a variety of goods from food and drink, to potions, to jewels, to magic items. The group inspected a few of the items that the Wind Riders had to offer, and May inquired about her very specific pocket watch. The jeweler, who introduced himself as Dendron, didn't recognize the description of the piece, but said he would keep an eye out for it and contact May via the sending spell if he found it. Hubert said that the Wind Riders were composed of a handful of merchants that left their shops to become part of a traveling group, selling high-quality items to other travelers and adventurers. Mavis sold some Dust of Disappearance to the Wind Riders, but other than that, the group agreed that they didn't need anything from them, and they concluded their transactions as the Wind Riders returned to their cloud form and flew off into the Freelands. After much travel, the group finally arrived in the rock gnome city of Sprockton. The first thing immediately visible was a massive spire of rock that rose close to 1,000 feet in the sky, with a ring of some metallic creation that went entirely around the circumference of the rock. Stone buildings scattered the rocky landscape, and 2 elevators sat at the base of the spire. Gnomes made their way through town with a myriad of inventions, from large rolling metallic vehicles to small innocuous everyday items that very clearly contained a greater function. Mavis asked how to register for the inventory, and a gnome that introduced himself as Ronwyn said that it had to be done within the Bolt, the massive rock spire in the center of town, that was also apparently laced with adamantium. Before entering the Bolt, Ronwyn told Mavis to not mess with the Spanners, which were the local guard force of Sprockton. Rock gnomes that wore a mishmash of various items that seemed like they'd just been added to their gear as they were invented. Finally, Ronwyn said to not do anything that would harm the Welders, which were apparently the 3 gnomish leaders of Sprockton, and then he told the group that they could find lodging at a tavern known as the Loose Screw, run by Brimira Wildbraid. After absorbing this information, May took the horses to a local stables, and then the group boarded the elevator to enter the Bolt. Once inside, the environment changed to an interior formed primarily from steel, with a steel tunnel traveling along the circumference of the Bolt, a large wide open area at the center, and doors that led to a tram that traveled along the outside of the Bolt. Using a map provided by one of the Spanners, the group made their way to the Loose Screw, where they purchased a room for their stay. Zeos asked if there was a library to learn of the history of Sprockton, and Brimira, the tavern keeper that also went by Brimi, told him that one of the Welders, Wilbar Quillcrag, loves to share knowledge on the subject. Gar suggested that with the spare time available to the group, they could look for some work to earn some extra gold while they wait for the inventory, as they were 9 days early. May inquired about any religious buildings within Sprockton, and Brimi said that she didn't know much about it, but that some of the gnomes pay homage to the prime elementals Kindra and Roke, although she wasn't quite sure where. Mavis asked for a drink that would not dull the mind, and Brimi excitedly went to the back of the tavern and brewed Mavis a cup of coffee, a beverage that both May and Zeos had heard of, and that Mavis was quite fond of. Brimi told Mavis that he should speak with a receptionist to learn more about the inventory, but she did say that it was split into 2 segments, one for inventions for everyday life and one for inventions for combat. Brimi said that some of the gnomes weren't too happy about the combat section being added, but if there were any combat inventions that were impressive enough for the Spanners to use in defense of Sprockton, the inventor would get special recognition and payment for such inventions. The group, now including a coffee-powered Mavis, made their way to the outer tram, a prospect that made May a bit nervous. And once the group strapped into the tram, the tunnel lifted, causing gravity to carry them to the next quadrants, where Mavis could sign up for the inventory. After a few questions from the receptionist, Mavis was asked to present an invention he had already made, and he demonstrated his multi-purpose gloves, after which he was given a ticket and welcomed as a participant of the inventory. Mavis realized that his chilling mug could also be displayed in the daily living portion of the inventory, and Gar agreed to be the one to demonstrate its function while Mavis participated in the combat portion of the inventory. Finally, Mavis decided to return to the Midway Manor to crunch some numbers on his BattleBot before the inventory, and Zeos asked if May could return with him to the manor so he could ask her something. After making their way to Zeos' room, Zeos took on a more downcast expression as he became very contemplative. He asked May if she had ever killed anyone, a question that caught her off guard, and she hesitantly said that she had, once. Zeos expressed his concern of whether the archer deserved what they did to him after he killed Gar, and May said that it was hard to say and that ultimately it was one form of cruelty replacing another. Zeos said that while he had killed things such as goblins, zombies, and monstrous creatures, he'd never killed a human, and he wasn't sure how to deal with it. May shared what she could, saying that it's never easy, and reminded Zeos that he has everyone in the group to lean on for support. Zeos said that he wanted to talk to Gar about it, but admitted that he was afraid to, and decided to ask May instead. May assured Zeos that she would keep his conversation confidential, but she also told him that she herself has shared difficult information with Gar, and that he's open to it, and is just as kind. Zeos invited May to meditate with him for a while, offering to teach her what he could. May agreed to stay for the time being to offer whatever comfort she could, while Mavis continued to draw up new schematics and crunch some numbers on improvements to his barrel BattleBot in preparation for his expo.